Olivia Carter had always believed in quiet excellence. She wasn't the kind who bragged about her design awards or dropped names of luxury clients she'd once worked with in her 30s. She simply let her work speak for itself: sleek branding packages, bold color stories, meticulous typography. For 30 years, she had been the steady hand behind the curtain, the one people turned to when deadlines loomed and egos clashed. But lately, it was as if her presence no longer registered in the office halls of Vanta Creative. It started subtly. Her name was missing from an email thread she should have led. A client pitch was handed off to a younger colleague with half her experience. Then came the real insult: a junior associate named Brett Coleman, barely 30 and barely competent, was promoted to creative director, a position Olivia had mentored half the team for. She wasn't even in the meeting when they announced it. Later that afternoon, Brett swaggered over to her desk, his tone oily with false sympathy. "Hey Olivia, they figured you'd be more comfortable sticking to the legacy clients. You know, stuff with less creative push." He winked. "Let the new generation take the reins a little, yeah?" Olivia didn't reply. Not because she didn't have words, but because the only ones that rose to her lips were ones she'd regret. She offered a thin smile, nodding once, then turned back to her screen. That night, she stayed in the office later than usual. The building dimmed around her. She opened her archived folders, decade-spanning projects that had won awards, campaigns that had pulled the company through lean quarters. Her name wasn't on any of them publicly. Just tiny metadata files tucked deep inside digital archives. She scrolled through one old campaign, 2007, the rebrand of a women's health initiative. She remembered staying up 72 hours straight to deliver that. Brett hadn't even graduated high school then. She opened a new document and titled it, The Erasure. No logos. No slogans. Just that word. In the following weeks, her workspace shrank. Brett called it streamlining. Olivia called it what it was, an erasure. Her responsibilities were stripped away, bit by bit, until she was left handling print proofs and resizing graphics for social media interns. Once, she caught a younger colleague using her old mood boards and calling them retro inspiration. She didn't speak up. Not yet. Instead, she began to sketch again, not for work, but for herself. Lines bled onto napkins during lunch. Shapes bloomed in the margins of meeting notes. Her fingers, once rigid from mouse clicks, remembered the fluidity of charcoal and watercolor. Each piece whispered something different. A cracked porcelain bust with a perfect smile. A wolf in a three-piece suit, seated behind a desk shaped like a cage. A woman, faceless and silent, with her hands bound in red tape. She didn't know what she was making. Only that she had to keep going. At home, her daughter Jasmine noticed. "You're painting again?" "Just clearing my head," Olivia replied. But it wasn't just therapy. It was documentation. Reclamation. A slow and steady recording of everything that had been taken, from her voice, her space, her place. One evening, Brett walked past her desk with two junior designers in tow. "She's great with the boring stuff," he joked, loud enough for Olivia to hear. They chuckled. Olivia didn't look up. Inside, she filed that moment away, not with bitterness, but with precision. Some people get loud when they're disrespected. Others disappear. Olivia chose a third option. She picked up her brush. And this time, she wasn't painting for them. She was painting for war. Olivia didn't quit. She vanished, quietly, strategically, from the center of the storm. Each morning, she still arrived at Vanta Creative by 8:27 a.m., exactly 3 minutes before the daily stand-up. She stood in the back of the conference room, nodded when spoken to, took notes no one asked her to take. Brett called her our anchor, a word that once implied strength but now sounded like dead weight. But every evening, Olivia became someone else. By 6 p.m., she was home, her dinner reheated and untouched. She moved through the apartment barefoot, flipping on a single lamp in the spare bedroom, a space that once housed forgotten holiday decorations and now served a greater purpose. It became her studio. The walls were bare, save for one print Jasmine had made in high school, an abstract burst of pink and gold. Olivia taped butcher paper across the wall and began sketching in chalk pastels and graphite, sometimes in complete silence, other times with Coltrane or Nina Simone pouring from a dusty speaker in the corner. She called the room the silent studio, though the quiet inside it was loud. Each piece began with a single word. Erased. Muted. Token. Decorative. Seasoned. Words she had heard in HR meetings, performance reviews, whispered conversations in hallways. She translated them into images. A woman with tape over her mouth, surrounded by laughing mannequins. A door marked "Creative Teen" with no handle on her side. A mirror with no reflection, only post-it notes saying "Not a good fit." By the end of the third week, the room looked like a gallery of grievances, painted with restraint but soaked in rage. And yet, they weren't bitter. They were precise. Beautiful. And devastating. Jasmine noticed the change first. "Mom," she said one night, standing in the doorway, "why don't you show these to someone? Like, for real." Olivia smiled without turning. "They're not ready." But what she meant was, she wasn't ready. Not yet. Until one morning, she overheard a conversation that turned the tide. Brett and another exec were talking near the printer, unaware that Olivia stood just around the corner. "I told her we're phasing her out slowly," Brett said. "Honestly, I don't think she even notices." The exec chuckled. "She's almost 60. What's she gonna do? Start over?" That evening, Olivia painted until her fingers cramped. She slept 2 hours. The next night, 4. Then back to 2. By the weekend, the silent studio held 12 fully finished pieces. 12 stories. 12 truths. She didn't need a gallery. She had the internet. Jasmine helped her create an anonymous Instagram account. They called it the Silent Brush. No names, no bios, no hashtags, just raw art and short captions beneath each image. Within 48 hours, the account had 3,000 followers. Within a week, 20,000. Women from all over the world began commenting. "I feel seen. This is my story too. This just made me cry. Thank you." The press came next. Small at first, an indie design blog, a women's empowerment newsletter. Then larger, The Cut. Fast Company. NPR called and requested an interview. Olivia politely declined. The brush would speak. And then came the email. A client Vanta had been courting for months, a global cosmetics brand, sent a terse message. "We've come across the Silent Brush. Some of the imagery is clearly referencing our brand's past campaigns. We're uncomfortable proceeding with your firm." Brett panicked. Slack messages buzzed. Meetings were held. Olivia watched silently from across the office, her screen filled with the black and white brushstrokes of her newest post, a house of cards collapsing under the weight of a single paintbrush. She didn't gloat. She didn't smirk. She simply uploaded one final image that evening. A woman sitting at a drafting table, painting herself back into a frame she'd once been erased from. She titled it, simply, "Return." And this time, she signed her name. Olivia Carter. The post titled "Return" didn't just go viral. It detonated. By dawn, the Silent Brush had over 200,000 followers. Olivia's inbox was flooded with messages, from journalists, art critics, survivors of workplace discrimination, and even gallery curators asking to exhibit her work. But more importantly, women wrote in, pouring out stories that mirrored her own, being overlooked, undermined, erased. What no one expected, not even Olivia, was what happened next. An anonymous employee leaked internal emails from Vanta Creative. One of them, from Brett Coleman, read, "Let's use Olivia as a placeholder. We'll feature her in the pitch deck for the diversity numbers, but keep her off the real design meetings." Another, "She's nearing retirement age. HR says we just need a bit more documentation to push her out without risk. The emails spread like wildfire. By the end of the day, the hashtag erased but not silent was trending on Twitter. Women began posting their own stories, inspired by Olivia's art, using screenshots of her work as a backdrop. It became a movement. Olivia didn't seek revenge. But justice came anyway. A week later, Vanta's biggest corporate client, an eco-conscious fashion brand known for its progressive values, announced they were severing all ties with the firm. 3 more followed. Within 10 days, Vanta Creative lost over 40% of their revenue pipeline. Brett Coleman went silent on LinkedIn. By week 3, a new headline appeared on Design Wire. The Silent Brush speaks, Olivia Carter breaks her silence in first live exhibit. The gallery opening was modest but packed. Jasmine stood at her side, beaming. Olivia wore black, simple and elegant, with a silver brooch shaped like a paintbrush. One by one, guests walked past her pieces, some pausing in front of Muted, others in front of Token. Many wept. Others took photos, not of themselves, but of the art alone. No filters. No captions. One woman, maybe in her 70s, touched Olivia's arm and whispered, "Thank you for painting what I never had the courage to say." In the back corner of the gallery hung Return, now framed in gold leaf. It was the only piece with a name attached to it. That night, Olivia sat outside under a string of cafe lights with Jasmine and a few close friends from her new collective of artists. She sipped wine, smiled as conversations fluttered around her, and felt something she hadn't known in years. Peace. But also power. Because for the first time in decades, Olivia didn't need someone to validate her seat at the table. She had built a new one, out of color, courage, and canvas. Later that week, a podcast invited her to speak about the silent brush movement. The host asked, "What was the moment you knew you had taken your power back?" Olivia paused, thoughtful. Then replied, "It wasn't one moment. It was 1,000 brushstrokes. Quiet. Steady. Intentional. Until finally, the silence became louder than the noise. And for those still trapped in toxic workplaces, unsure whether to speak or stay quiet, her final words echoed across airwaves and hearts. Your voice doesn't have to be loud to be heard. It just has to be true. Months passed. The viral wave settled into something quieter but deeper, a ripple that moved outward in steady circles. Olivia no longer checked follower counts. She no longer worried whether people liked or shared her work. That need, the hunger to be seen by those who once looked past her, had faded. Not because she stopped caring, but because she had finally turned the lens inward and saw herself, fully and clearly. She still painted, but now in a sunlit studio she shared with 3 other midlife women, artists who, like her, had once believed their best years were behind them. Together, they created not just art, but a refuge. A place where experience wasn't dismissed, where gray hair and calloused hands were signs of mastery, not decay. Every Thursday, Olivia held open studio sessions. Sometimes 10 women showed up. Sometimes just one. They brought their fears, their unfinished dreams, their doubts, and she handed them brushes, not to teach, but to remind them they were still capable of making marks that mattered. Jasmine visited often. Their bond had grown stronger, not through apologies but through understanding. One afternoon, as they stood side by side at an easel, Jasmine said softly, "I used to think strength meant speaking up loud. But you showed me silence can be just as powerful." Olivia smiled, pressing her brush gently against canvas. "Silence isn't absence," she replied. "Sometimes it's presence, waiting for the right moment." Back in her home, above her writing desk, hung the first version of Muted. Not the one the world saw, but the one she had painted in grief, frustration, and raw defiance. Its colors had faded a little with time, but the message remained bold beneath the brushstrokes. It reminded her of where she had been. It reminded her that creation could be resistance. That truth could take many forms. That even in the stillness, you could build something lasting. And most of all, It reminded her that she had not been erased. She had, finally, become the author of her own story. Quiet. Fierce. Free. This story reminds us that creativity is power, and even in silence, there's strength. What did you think about Olivia's journey? Did her silent counterattack resonate with you? Leave a comment with number 2 if you loved the story, and number 7 if you didn't. And if you've ever faced something similar, we'd love to hear your voice. Don't forget to like, share, and subscribe to True Tales, where I, Natalie, bring you inspiring stories of resilience and redemption every single day.